Not to be confused with Camden, New Jersey, which is often ranked as one of the most dangerous cities in America, the London borough of Camden is one of the most famous tourist spots our city has to offer. To the casual visitor, it would be difficult to see how this thriving area with its bustling markets and high property prices could be so dangerous beneath the surface. But that's the thing about London. Unlike the sprawling cities of the United States, being such a densely populated area, you might go from standing next to a multi-million-pound property and turn one corner and find yourself in the middle of one of the city's most deprived council estates, or projects as you Americans would probably call it. Camden itself is located in northwest London, and is one of the 32 boroughs, meaning administrative areas, that make up Greater London. The current borough of Camden was created in 1965, when London's administrative area was expanded to incorporate the Greater London, and it includes districts or neighbourhoods, many of which are famous for their ostentatious wealth, such as Hampstead, Kentish Town, Camden Town, Kilburn, Somers Town, King's Cross, St Pancras, Chalk Farm, Haverstock, and Gospel Oak. One of these neighbourhoods you are most likely to be aware of is Camden Town, also often just called Camden, that the borough is named after, and that's where much of the events of this video will take place. Camden Town has been known around the world since the 1960s as the heart of London's art and cultural scene, with it being home to famous music venue The Roundhouse, where acts like Pink Floyd performed in their early years. In later decades, Camden's music venues and bars were scenes where bands like Coldplay and Oasis first made their names. And over the years, through every era of music, Camden has been home to many famous musicians, including the singer Amy Winehouse, with her unfortunately being found dead in her $3.5 million Camden Square home in 2011. Nowadays, a statue of Amy Winehouse can be seen in Camden, and her former home has become a tourist attraction to her fans, despite it having new owners. Moreover, over the years, Camden has been a breeding ground for many different urban youth countercultures like the punks, ravers, and hippies. Ultimately, Camden is one of those places where outsiders and nonconformists can fit in, call home, and flourish. And perhaps as a result of the openness and tolerance fostered in the area, over the years, Camden, or more specifically Camden Town, has become a tourist attraction in its own right. Best known for its popular street markets specializing in arts, counterculture and alternative clothing, delicious and trendy street food, and maybe the odd bit of counterfeit designer clothing and smoking accessories that I'm sure fans of this channel will probably enjoy. In fact, speaking of smoke shops, Camden has for a long time been known to be a hotspot for illegal drug markets, sometimes even being referred to as the Amsterdam of the UK. Despite Camden's countercultural ethos still being somewhat intact, the area has also gained attention in recent years for arguably going through a significant gentrification. Similar to many other boroughs of London, which despite the natives struggling with rising costs of living, the push still continues to demolish affordable housing and replace it with multi-million-pound new build developments, often only affordable to the super wealthy, often even being used as investments for overseas investors, meaning that many of these expensive and new homes built in these areas are often left empty, all while wealthy Chinese and Russian investors cash in on the constantly rising property markets in London from the comfort of overseas, without ever even stepping foot in Camden and risking a potential shanking. This gentrification process only tells part of the story, because Camden really is an area with some of the biggest wealth gaps and income equality in the United Kingdom. As I mentioned at the start, many of the poorest estates in London exist literally a block away from multi-million-pound mansions. These are the kind of multi-million-pound mansions you might expect to see in prime spots right next to Camden Square, which is only 6 minutes walk away from the formerly neglected Agar Grove estate. This estate is home to the depressing council block Lulworth House, which was featured prominently on the cover of Suspect's album Suspicious Activity, and is the birthplace of the menacing street crew Active Gang, who we will be discussing extensively in this video. Now, when I went to visit the area, I was struck by just how much this depressing and brutalist old council block stood out amongst the newly built private luxury developments surrounding it in the neighbourhood. Anyway, despite their close proximity to the multi-million-pound properties, the British equivalent of public housing, or the projects, known here as council housing or council estates, tend to be the areas where gang violence is most common. Now, it's important to remind you that when I say estate, I'm not talking about a large, luxurious swathe of land somewhere in the countryside, along with a luxurious mansion and swans. So-called council estates are typically large, publicly owned projects that offer affordable social housing, generally cramming as many families on low pay into cramped apartment buildings. However, nowadays, many of the old council estates are being torn down and to a lesser extent replaced by private housing associations run for profit. Part of the reason this has been allowed to happen is because of the bad reputation that council council estates have fostered, becoming notorious hotspots for criminal activity and antisocial behaviour. In the UK, we also have a right to buy policy, which allows individuals that are living in social housing the opportunity to actually buy that property privately from the government. That would give an individual that's living on social housing a great opportunity to take their first step on the ladder towards homeownership. But the unfortunate side effect of that policy means that the next person who's looking for social housing is less likely to find it because the government are slowly selling off the social housing and not replacing them. This is a significant contributor to the UK's ongoing housing crisis, and it's a big reason why the housing in London is so ridiculously expensive. And unfortunately, despite all the tourists and rich inhabitants, as well as Camden's close proximity to London's high-earning financial districts, the social unrest in Camden's poor communities and social housing has led Camden to become increasingly dangerous over the years, with particularly brutal murders taking place right on the streets, sometimes even in broad daylight. But before getting more in depth on the gangs in the area that are driving this violent crime, on a more positive note, Camden also has a rich history when it comes to UK rap music. For example, one of the first real breakthrough UK rap groups hails from Camden, the infamous and divisive rap trio N-Dubz, who were among the first British rap groups to gain popularity when UK rap went from underground to the national mainstream during the 2000s. In the late noughties, a new wave of British gangster rap emerged called road rap. This saw artists such as South London's own Giggs gaining national popularity by showing an authentic look at Britain and especially London's gang underworld. In many ways, the British road rap wave predates and foreshadowed the gritty and raw visual aesthetics that Chicago drill music videos would end up popularizing globally years later. Some young gang-affiliated rappers from Camden would also start dropping songs, including artists like Ambush, Prospect, and Rowdy, who repped the Queen's Crescent gang located in the postcode NW5 in the Kentish Town neighbourhood. In fact, Queen's Crescent, or QC, has been considered as one of the most notorious hoods in Camden for some time due to extensive gang activity. And while Ambush made a considerable name for himself in the British rap scene since then, unfortunately in 2012, Rowdy, real name Sean Ferdinand, ended up receiving a life sentence for allegedly stabbing and killing a young man and attempting to kill another. By mid-2010s, many of Camden's gangs were actually united under one banner called Cracktown, or CT, and in 2015, Cracktown affiliates YD and JP would release their song Man Down, which is arguably one of the first UK drill songs recorded in North London to gain prominence. This was just a little while after the UK drill genre had been emerged, mainly coming out of South London, with pioneering South London drillers from sets like 150 from Brixton being some of the first British rappers to make drill music influenced by Chicago drill. Sadly, the music video for Man Down also seems to mark one of the last times that these different Camden gang sets known as Cracktown came together on good terms whilst pursuing more positive goals like music. Because soon after this video released, the music side of Camden gang life would slow down as members would focus on a deadly war that was brewing in the streets. And sadly, in the years that followed that music video, many of the young men depicted in it would find themselves being forced to pick a side in what would end up becoming one of the most violent street feuds London had ever seen. Camden, like other boroughs of London that have significant populations struggling with poverty, has for a long time been affected by gangs. For example, notorious former gangster Marvin Herbert grew up in Camden. He was suspected of up to 24 murders with his Yardie Hit Squad gang, one of many Jamaican Caribbean gangs that operated in London during that period. Herbert, who is now in his 50s and a reformed public speaker, youth worker and YouTuber, has discussed in numerous interviews and videos his upbringing in the rough working class estates in Camden where his family moved to from Liverpool when he was young. Raised by a drug dealer father who commonly beat up both him and his mother, Herbert fell into the life of crime and gangs since a very young age, until he was apparently shot numerous times in 2008, causing him to lose one of his eyes and eventually making him leave the life of gangs and crime behind. In the 90s, the Camden neighbourhood of Somerstown saw many Caucasian families moving out, with many migrant families of particularly Asian backgrounds migrating to the area and calling it home. Unfortunately, due to racial tensions in the area, this would eventually lead to a race war between the poorest white youths still living there and the Asian youths who had moved in recently. The animosity in the area between these two groups exploded after a 15-year-old white boy, Richard Everett, was stabbed to death by a gang of British Bangladeshi youths who were apparently seeking revenge against another white youth in the area. After this, white youth gangs began patrolling the streets of Somerstown, attacking anyone of Asian background that they came across, even firebombing a halal butcher shop. This was an incredibly violent and volatile time in Camden, and ironically, despite the media attention surrounding the current UK drill scene and the violence it's allegedly responsible for, the homicide rate in the UK actually peaked in the early 2000s. This was reflected in Camden, which was perceived to be particularly out of control at the time, with violent crime and gang clashes leading papers to argue that Camden Town was up there with some of the world's worst murder capitals. Gangs in London around this time were also generally much larger than they are now, with as many as 100 members in each gang. A gang which rep the postcode district NW1 that covers a large section of South Camden were beefing with the entire area of the postcode district NW5, which covers much of North Camden. In 2007, a document by Scotland Yard's Special Crime Directorate that was seemingly leaked to news outlets and online listed a whopping 257 gangs allegedly operating in Greater London boroughs. In Camden, the document, which was at the time argued to already be a little bit outdated, listed a total of 8 gangs active in the area. This included the Born Sick Crew, Centric Gang, the Cromer Street Massive, the Denton Boys, the Drummond Street Posse, the NW1 Boys, aka Cumbo Gang, the Peckwater Gang, and WC1. The Drummond Street Posse hailed from around the busy Euston train station and were thought to have been involved in that 1994 killing of Richard Everett. The group was also allegedly involved in a violent clash with another gang, the Cromer Street Massive, from around King's Cross Station in 2003. In 2006, the Centric Gang received media attention after one of their alleged members, a young student named Mahir Osman, also known as Smiley, was brutally stabbed by alleged rival gang members from Tottenham. According to the news article, Centric Gang hailed from the Chalk Farm neighbourhood where the famous music venue The Roundhouse is. But according to a childhood friend of Smiley, journalist Ismail Inarshe, Centric Gang were a Somali-based gang that had members all over the Camden borough. In 2007, another gang, the Denton Boys, who were from the Denton estate in the Kentish Town neighbourhood, were allegedly terrorising the neighbourhood, committing daily robberies and other violent crimes. In 2008, local news and blogs were reporting of another gang called the Money Squad, or TMS, reportedly another largely Somalian origin gang, who were allegedly selling large amounts of drugs around the Camden street markets. That same year, newspapers would also report of an alleged member of the Money Squad, Sharmak Hassan, being shot to death in what seemed like a gang-related incident. Years later, a reformed gang member and popular Muslim motivational speaker and social media influencer Abu Taymiyyah Jailani would talk about his time in Camden gangs, describing it as Postcode Wars, but also mentioning how his gang was mostly Somalians and Yemenis from Kentish Town, whereas their ops were African-British guys of a mixed-race heritage.
Those who I used to hang around with are mostly like Somalis and Yemenis. Okay, he was more situated in Kentish Town, but used to come to Camden a lot because the other elders were there. We was trying to at that time rep this postcode called NW1, and we used to fight against these African British guys, mixed race guys, all because of a postcode. I have all these scars on my head, on my body. A friend of mine was shot, and this was in Camden, and it was the reason as to why I left the streets.
Another example of how race and ethnicity have for the longest time been central in igniting Camden's gang conflicts is a 2009 local news report identifying so-called no-go zones in certain Camden neighbourhoods, including the Peckwater estate, home of the Peckwater Gang in Kentish Town. In these no-go zones, patrolling officers were reportedly commonly attacked with rocks by gangs when they tried to enter the estate. Moving into the 2010s, a special task force was set up by the Camden police in an attempt to tackle gang-related violence. This led to numerous arrests of alleged drug gangs in Camden, including in the Queen's Crescent area. By 2011, tensions boiled over between minority youths, many of whom were affiliated with local gangs, and the London police. In the wake of the fatal shooting of alleged gang member Mark Duggan by the police in nearby Tottenham, this brutal use of force on London streets, followed by the Met Police attempting to avoid accountability for the killing, led to days of major protests which escalated into riots all over London, including Camden. Despite the unrest, violent crime in London fell significantly during the first half of the 2010s, bottoming out in 2014 when the homicide rate actually fell below 100 per 100,000 inhabitants, which was largely attributed to the London police's fight against gangs. However, already the following year in 2015, the homicides begun increasing again significantly, with this actually coinciding with the emergence of UK drill music in mainstream London youth culture, as artists such as the 6-7 Crew and Harlem Spartans begun to gain popularity throughout the city, giving the whole world a window into life as a young gang member on one of London's many dangerous estates. These early pioneers of the UK drill genre and the beatmakers who brought these lyrics to life eventually led to the distinctive sound of UK drill being born, with the sliding 808s, wavy percussive patterns, and creative snare placements that made it a unique sound and eventually a global movement, as the sound of UK drill would later spread to the projects of Brooklyn and the Bronx in New York, influencing some of the Big Apple's most prominent drill artists like 22Gs and Pop Smoke. Also in 2015, many news outlets begun reporting reporting on maps published online showing the alleged territories of different gangs in London. One of these maps is still available and appears to list gangs in Camden such as the QC Blocks, Camden Marleys, Somerstown, Combo Blocks, Drummond Street Posse, Cromer Street Massive, and Agar Grove. Interestingly, many of these same gangs are mentioned in a 2019 Guardian article about knife gangs in London, which actually prompted a gang expert and former police officer from Camden to comment on these gangs on Twitter. He would dispute some of the information provided about the gangs in Camden and elaborating on how QC and Agar Grove were fraught with infighting, ultimately concluding how things turned for worse after 2014 when new gangs arrived in the territory of Camden all around the same time as an important gang police team was disbanded. It's around this time that the gangs involved in the events of this video begin truly getting active in the streets of Camden, as young men and teenage boys from the area would get sucked into the local gang politics and their deadly conflicts. In this story, there will be many names of many young men who played a role in the war playing out on the streets, as well as in the recording studios where those battling for dominance on the streets of Camden would boast and brag about their activities on the roads. However, there's one name that stands above all of them when it comes to brutality and notoriety. That's a young man by the name of Tariq Kennedy Mangal Monteiro, who you might know better as Suspect.